No, please. Stop, you're hurting me. Hold still. Hands behind your back now. I can't breathe, let go.
Stop resisting, get down.
Help, please, it hurts.
I said get down, don't fight back.
No, I can't, please.
Hold still.
You stay right there, old man.
Hey, I'm just getting my mail.
Don't lie to me. I saw what you did. You're not going anywhere.
You have to tell me what happened in there. N.O.
No.
Sir, please, I told you I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything.
You are coming with me now. No, please, you're hurting me. Stop resisting. You don't tell me what to do. Wait, what are you doing?
Boots. Hands where I can see them, old man. Right now, or I swear this gets a lot worse for you. Boots. The brass compass sat on the porch rail 3 feet away, exactly where it had sat every morning for 11 years, and Elijah Sanders would think about that compass for the rest of his life. How close it was, how useless it was, how nothing in this world could point him toward a direction that made any of this make sense. Boots. But that moment was still 20 minutes away. Boots. Right now, the sun over Birchwood Court was doing what it always did on a Saturday in late April, falling soft and amber across the rooftops of Sedgefield Park, the old post-war neighborhood on the west side of Charlotte, North Carolina, where the oak trees were older than most of the houses, and the houses were older than most of the people who lived in them. Boots. Sprinklers ticked somewhere down the block. A woodpecker worked at the dead limb of a sycamore. It was the kind of morning that made a person believe, for a little while, that the world had gone soft at the edges. Boots. Elijah knelt in the dirt, at the edge of his tomato bed, 71 years old, his knees announcing every movement the way old hinges do, pulling crabgrass out by the root with 2 fingers, because his wife always said pulling by the root was the only way that actually worked. Boots. You're going to need a hip replacement before that garden needs weeding again, Corinne Sanders said, kneeling beside him in her own gloves, the ones with the little embroidered daisy on the left thumb that she'd had since 2009. Boots. Better a bad hip than a bad attitude, Elijah said, and she laughed the same laugh she'd been laughing at him with for 44 years, since the summer of 1982 when he was a 27-year-old postal carrier with a bad car and a good heart, and she was a schoolteacher who had told her sister she'd never marry a man who whistled while he worked. Boots. He still whistled while he worked. She still married him anyway. Behind the white lace curtain of the house directly across Birchwood Court, Denise Fairweather watched them the way she'd been watching them for 3 weeks now. Boots. She did not garden. She did not sit on her porch with coffee the way her neighbors did on Saturday mornings. Boots. She watched, and lately, every time she looked at the Sanders' pale yellow house, with its wraparound porch and its 100-year-old oak, she did not see a home. Boots. She saw a number. Boots. $640,000 to be exact. The figure Ridgeline Capital Partners had quietly offered for the last 2 holdout lots on Birchwood Court, the 2 lots standing between them and a 68-unit luxury development called the Sedgefield Collection, breaking ground allegedly by autumn, contingent on full assemblage. Boots. Denise had already signed 7 other houses on this street. She had made $340,000 in commissions doing it. Boots. She had exactly 1 obstacle left, and his name was Elijah Sanders. And he had told her, twice gently, the way you tell someone something you hope they'll understand without you having to say it a 3rd time, that this house wasn't for sale. Boots. Not now. Not ever. His father had helped him buy it in 1988. His son had been born in the back bedroom during an ice storm because the ambulance couldn't make it up the hill. Boots. There was no number for that. Denise picked up her phone at 9:14 that morning. Her voice, when the dispatcher answered, went smooth and worried, a tone she had practiced without ever admitting to herself that she was practicing it. Boots. Yes, hi. I'm calling about a disturbance on Birchwood Court. There's an elderly man and woman I don't recognize, and they seem to be, I don't know, casing one of the properties. Boots. It's making me nervous. It was a lie built entirely out of true words. She knew exactly who Elijah and Corinne Sanders were. Boots. She had brought them a fruitcake the Christmas she moved in. But lies she had discovered somewhere in the last 6 months of watching her commission checks arrive later and thinner than she needed them to, worked faster than the truth when you wanted something to happen quickly. Boots. 16 minutes later, a Charlotte-Mecklenburg patrol cruiser rolled to a stop at the curb in front of the Sanders house, tires crunching over the loose gravel, where the city had never quite finished paving. Boots. Elijah felt it before he saw it, that old, familiar tightening low in the chest that black men of his generation carried the way other men carried a bad knee or a bad back, an injury that never fully healed because it was never allowed to. Boots. He had felt it in 1971, on a highway outside Rock Hill, South Carolina, a 19-year-old with a driver's license and nothing else in his pocket. Boots. He felt it now, 55 years later, in his own front yard, kneeling over his own tomatoes. Officer Grant Holloway got out of the car with his sunglasses already on, one hand resting near his belt before he'd said a single word, the posture of a man who had decided the shape of the encounter before he'd even seen the people in it. Boots. "Morning," Holloway said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a command wearing a greeting's clothes. "Morning, officer," Elijah said, rising slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees, with the careful, unhurried motion of a man who had learned, over 7 decades, exactly how dangerous a sudden movement could be. Boots. "Something wrong?" "Got a call about suspicious activity at this address." Holloway's eyes moved over both of them, lingering, cataloging. Boots. "You two live here?" 38 years, Corinne said, stepping closer to her husband. "This is our home." Holloway's jaw didn't soften. Boots. If anything, it tightened. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Elijah blinked. "ID for standing in my own yard?" Boots. "That's what I said." There was something in the way Holloway said it. Flat, bored, the tone of a man who had already decided the answer wouldn't change anything, who was simply waiting for a reason. Boots. "Remember that tone. It will matter again in about 40 minutes, when a different man in a different room asks Holloway to explain himself, and Holloway uses that exact same tone, and it will be the thing that finally ends him." Boots. Corinne felt her stomach twist. She had read the stories, she had watched the videos, the ones that always seemed to end the same way, regardless of how they began. Boots. She was not about to let her husband become one more name scrolling under a news anchor's chin. "Officer, we haven't done anything," she said, her voice trembling but holding its ground. Boots. "We're gardening. That's all this is, ma'am. I didn't ask for your opinion." Holloway's tone sharpened, cutting clean through the soft morning air. Boots. "I asked for a D." Elijah felt his pride bristle. 44 years of marriage, 31 years raising a son in this house, 71 years of being a black man in America, had taught him precisely how expensive pride could get in a moment like this one. Boots. He kept his voice level. "It's inside," he said slowly, "in my wallet on the kitchen counter. Then go get it." Boots. Elijah hesitated. Something about the way Holloway's hand still hovered at his belt made the simple, ordinary act of walking to his own front door feel like stepping across a minefield he couldn't see. Boots. "I'm going to step inside," Elijah said carefully, raising both hands slightly. Palms open, the universal grammar of a man trying not to be misunderstood. Boots. "Right there, through that door." Holloway said nothing. He watched, his face unreadable behind the dark lenses, his fingers twitching once near his belt as Elijah turned toward the porch steps. Boots. Elijah's foot touched the first step. That was all it took. "Stop right there." Holloway's voice cracked across the yard like a length of rope snapping taut. Boots. "Don't move." Elijah froze, one hand still raised. "I'm just getting my—" I said, "Don't move." Holloway was already coming around the front of the cruiser, fast now, his hand no longer hovering but gripping. Boots. "Turn around." "Officer, I told you, my ID is inside the house. You're not listening to me." Holloway's voice climbed, each word landing like something thrown. Boots. "I gave you a direct order." Elijah turned, slow and careful, his hands lifting to shoulder height. He had done everything the way you're supposed to do it. Boots. He had announced every movement, telegraphed every intention, offered every ounce of compliance a 71-year-old body could offer. None of it seemed to weigh anything at all. Boots. Holloway closed the distance in 3 strides and closed his hand around Elijah's arm, fingers digging into the loose skin above the elbow, into muscle that had carried mail sacks for 30 years and had not carried much of anything heavy in the 15 years since. Boots. "Ow." Elijah's knees buckled slightly under the sudden pull. "You're hurting me." Corinne's scream tore out of her before she'd decided to make it. Boots. She rushed forward, placing her whole small frame, 5'2", 118 pounds soaking wet, between her husband and the officer, shaking with a fury that had nowhere else to go. Boots. "Let go of him." He hasn't done anything. Ma'am, back up. Holloway's grip didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened, his knuckles whitening. Boots. You're hurting an old man for no reason. Corinne's voice cracked, tears stinging now. He built that porch you're standing on. Boots. This is our house. I don't care whose house it is. Boots. Holloway shoved her back with his free hand, hard enough that she stumbled into the porch railing and found herself on the very spot where, 11 years earlier, her son had bolted a brass compass into the wood as a joke gift, so his father would always know which way home was, no matter how many years he spent gardening in the same 600-square-foot yard. Boots. Up and down Birchwood Court, doors began opening. Curtains pulled aside. A boy of maybe 15 skidded his bike to a stop at the curb, phone already rising. Boots. Across the street, 78-year-old Ruth Okafor stepped onto her own porch, gasping, her phone rising too. Somebody help them, Ruth called out. Boots. Nobody moved closer. Nobody wanted to be the second name in tomorrow's headline. Elijah's arm throbbed under Holloway's grip. Boots. His chest went tight, his breath thin and fast, and for one long second he thought, with the strange, floating clarity that sometimes visits a person in the worst moment of their life, that he might actually die in his own front yard over a wallet on a kitchen counter. Boots. Please, Elijah said, all the careful calm draining out of his voice now. Please, I haven't done anything wrong. That's what they all say, Holloway muttered, twisting the arm further. Boots. Corinne's mind raced past panic into something colder and more useful. She thought of her son. Home on a 96-hour leave that had started 3 days ago, currently upstairs in the guest room he'd slept in since he was 6 years old. Currently, she hoped to God, awake. Boots. Malcolm, she screamed, turning toward the house, her voice tearing the morning open. Malcolm, help! Please help us! For one full second, nothing happened. Boots. Then the front door came open so fast it struck the wall, and a man filled the doorway, broad through the shoulders in a way that seemed to eat the daylight behind him, moving with the particular fast but unhurried gait of someone whose body had been trained for exactly this kind of morning, though never in a place that was supposed to be safe. Boots. Holloway's grip on Elijah loosened just slightly as his head snapped toward the new arrival, and behind the sunglasses his eyes went wide, taking in the size of the man now crossing the lawn. Boots. Get back, Holloway barked, releasing Elijah and pivoting, his hand dropping toward the taser holstered on his hip. Sir, I need you to stop right there. Boots. Malcolm Sanders didn't stop. He didn't run either. His steps stayed measured, deliberate. The steps of a man trained expensively by the United States government, not to let his body do what fear wanted it to do. Boots. That's my father, Malcolm said, his voice low and level, cutting through the noise like something poured rather than shouted. Boots. Take your hands off him. I said get back. There was fear in Holloway's voice now, thin and sharp, his fingers fumbling at the taser's release strap. Boots. I will tase you, I swear to God. Street had gone entirely silent. Phone stayed raised. Nobody breathed. Corinne pressed a shaking hand to her mouth, watching her son close the last of the distance between himself and an armed man threatening his father. Boots. Elijah, cradling his bruised arm, could only manage one word. Malcolm. Malcolm stopped 3 feet from Holloway, close enough to see the sweat gathering at the man's hairline, far enough to keep both hands visible and open at his sides. Boots. He raised no fists. He raised no voice. He simply stood there, an entire wall of stillness in the center of the storm, and placed his body directly between Holloway and his parents. Boots. Get back, Holloway shouted again, but the second word wavered, cracking under a weight it hadn't been built to carry. Boots. His hand was fully on the taser now, knuckles bone-white around the grip. I will drop you. You don't need to do that, Malcolm said. Boots. Flat, steady. The particular voice of a man who has been trained to sound calm while a building burns around him. Boots. I need you to back away from me right now. Holloway's command had started thinning with every syllable, a balloon losing air mid-sentence. Boots. This is your final warning. My name is Malcolm Sanders. He said it slow and clear, the cadence of something recited 100 times in 100 different rooms, because the world kept insisting on making him say it again. Boots. I'm a Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, SEAL Team 5. That man you're holding is my father. This is my parents' house. Boots. The words landed in the yard like a dropped plate. Holloway blinked. His grip on the taser faltered. I don't care, Boots. Check my belt, Malcolm said, lifting the hem of his shirt slowly, deliberately, revealing the military identification clipped at his waistband. Boots. It's right there. Look for yourself. A second officer, younger, freckled, the name Reyes stitched above his badge, had been hanging back near the cruiser this whole time, watching the encounter unravel with a growing sickness in his stomach. Boots. Now he stepped closer, his eyes catching something on Malcolm's forearm, a faded trident tattoo, the unmistakable insignia inked into skin that had earned it. Boots. Holloway. Reyes's voice was quiet, urgent. Look at his arm. Holloway's eyes dropped, the trident, the ID clipped at the waist. Boots. The way this man, easily twice his size, easily capable of ending the encounter with one motion, hadn't raised so much as a hand in anger, hadn't even raised his voice past a level tone. Boots. Something behind Holloway's sunglasses cracked. The certainty that had carried him through the last 11 minutes, the assumption that had let him grab a 71-year-old man's arm without a flicker of doubt, began to wobble on its foundation. Boots. That doesn't. Holloway's voice had gone small. That doesn't change anything. It changes everything, Reyes said, stepping fully between his partner and Malcolm now, one hand raised toward Holloway. Boots. Grant. Stand down now. On the street, every phone stayed raised, but no one was speaking anymore. The teenager on the bike had his mouth open. Boots. Ruth Okafor lowered her phone an inch, staring at the scene rearranging itself in front of her like furniture in an earthquake. Boots. A decorated Navy SEAL, standing in his own parents' front yard, being threatened with an electric weapon because a frightened man with a badge had decided, the instant he saw a large black man crossing a lawn at speed, that the man must be the danger rather than the sun. Boots. Corinne sank against the porch railing, one hand pressed to her chest, watching her son stand perfectly still, while a man twice debated whether to fire 50,000 volts into him. Boots. Elijah, cradling his bruised arm, felt something hot rise in his throat that 38 years of homeownership, 3 decades of federal service, and a lifetime of paid taxes had apparently never earned him. Boots. It had taken his son announcing a military rank for an officer to finally see him as a human being instead of a threat. Boots. Holloway's hand came slowly off the taser. He swallowed, glancing at the wall of raised phones, at his partner's pale and horrified face, at the old man still holding his bruised arm a few feet away. Boots. I'm going to need everyone to just calm down. We are calm, Malcolm said quietly. You're the one who needs to think very carefully about what you do next. Boots. The street held its breath, waiting to see whether Officer Grant Holloway would listen. Holloway lowered his hand fully from his belt, but his face stayed flushed, tight with the particular anger of a man humiliated in front of an audience he hadn't chosen. Boots. All right, he said, the words clipped and forced. All right, everybody, back off. Show's over. He turned to Elijah, who was still working the feeling back into the arm. Holloway's fingers had bruised down to the bone. Boots. Sorry for the, He wouldn't meet Elijah's eyes. The misunderstanding. It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was the sound a man makes when he wants a moment to be finished, not the sound a man makes when he actually understands what he's done. Boots. Elijah heard the difference. So did Corinne. So did every neighbor still standing on their porch with a phone in hand. Boots. Reyes put a hand on Holloway's shoulder, steering him back toward the cruiser before he could make anything worse. Let's go. Boots now. The 2 officers climbed into the patrol car. Holloway didn't look back as the engine turned over. The cruiser pulled away, tires spitting gravel, and within a minute it had rounded the corner and disappeared, leaving Birchwood Court to settle back, slowly, unconvincingly, into the shape of an ordinary Saturday. Boots. Remember the number 340,000. It will come back. Malcolm turned to his parents, his shoulders finally dropping out of the rigid, controlled posture he'd held through the entire confrontation. Boots, Dad. He took his father's arm gently, examining the red marks already blooming along the skin. Let me see that. Boots. I'm fine, Elijah said, though his voice shook as the adrenaline began draining out of him all at once. You're not fine. Boots. Sit. Elijah sat on the porch steps, his guard finally coming down. Corinne lowered herself beside him, her hands trembling as she inspected the bruising forming under her husband's sleeve. Boots. Her fingers found the brass compass bolted to the railing without her quite meaning to touch it, the way a hand finds a rosary bead without being told to. Boots. That man had no right, she said, her voice tight with fury. No, Malcolm agreed. He didn't. Inside, later that evening, the three of them sat together at the kitchen table under the warm yellow lamp, plates of food in front of them that none of them had much appetite for. Boots. Elijah picked at his rice, his bruised arm resting on a folded dish towel. "You should have seen your face," Corinne told Malcolm, trying to lighten the room, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Boots, that man about fainted when he saw your arm." Malcolm managed a small smile that didn't hold. "I don't like how fast he went for that taser." Boots. "He was scared," Elijah said. "Scared of a black man standing up for his family. That's the whole of it." Boots. Corinne set her fork down, her brow tightening. "You know what's bothering me more?" Both men looked at her. "Denise." Boots. She said the name low, like something she was still deciding whether to trust with air. "She was watching us from her window this morning." Boots. "Right before that cruiser showed up." Malcolm's jaw set. "You think she called it in?" "I don't know." Corinne admitted it slowly. Boots. "But she's been strange for months, ever since that community meeting about the development, asking us, real casual-like, whether we'd ever thought about selling." Boots. Elijah waved a hand, unconvinced. "Denise is harmless. Nosy, maybe. Harmless." Malcolm said nothing, but something uneasy settled into his chest, the same instinct that had kept men alive in places far more dangerous than a quiet street in Sedgefield Park, and it was telling him, quietly and insistently, that his father was wrong. Boots. After dinner, Malcolm walked the perimeter of the house checking window latches, a habit 14 years of deployments had welded into his bones, and that peacetime had never quite unwelded. Boots. When he reached the front porch, he stood a long moment looking out at the dark, ordinary street where, hours earlier, his father had been grabbed and threatened over a wallet. Boots. His fingers found the brass compass on the railing, turned it once, let it settle. It's not over, he thought, though he couldn't yet say why he believed that. Boots. He was right. Denise Fairweather did not sleep that Saturday night. She lay awake beside her husband, who slept the untroubled sleep of a man who had no idea his wife had, that morning, called 911 on their neighbors of 11 years, and fabricated a story out of nothing but her own mortgage payment. Boots. She told herself the same things she'd been telling herself for 3 weeks, that it wasn't really a lie, just an exaggeration. Boots. That the police would have found nothing wrong and simply moved on, that Elijah and Corinne would never even know it was her. Boots. What she did not know, could not have known, sitting in her dark bedroom running numbers in her head, was that Ridgeline Capital Partners had already begun quietly compiling a file on every agent who'd helped assemble properties for the Sedgefield collection. A file that would, in 11 days, land on a city council desk and blow her career into pieces small enough to fit in an evidence folder. Boots. Pay attention to that file. It will surface again, and when it does, it will not be Denise who opens it. Boots. By Sunday morning, the video of Officer Grant Holloway grabbing a 71-year-old man's arm had been uploaded by the teenager on the bike, a 17-year-old named Cody Marsh, to a platform where, by noon, it had 11,000 views, and by 6 that evening, it had 412,000. Boots. By Monday, it had become a story that a local reporter named Dana Whitmore, 29 years old, and 2 years into a career she'd started believing would mostly involve city council budget meetings, decided she needed to understand from the inside rather than the outside. Boots. Dana knocked on the Sanders door at 4:40 that afternoon, notebook in hand, and found Elijah on the porch, the bruises on his arm gone from red to a deep, ugly purple-black, the exact color of a plum left too long on the counter. Boots. "Mr. Sanders, I'm with the Charlotte Ledger. I'd like to hear this from you, not from a video." Elijah studied her for a long moment before he answered. Boots. "Sit down then," he said, gesturing to the second porch chair. "I've got time. Man my age, that's about all I've got left of it." Boots. He told her everything. The tomatoes, the call, the arm, the taser. His son's voice cutting through the yard like something poured out of cold water. Boots. He told her about the compass on the railing, and when she asked why it mattered, he said only, "Ask my son when he's ready to tell you," and left it there. Boots. Dana wrote for 40 minutes without interrupting once. "Why didn't you fight back?" she asked finally, gently, the question every reader would eventually ask too. Boots. Elijah looked out at the street where it had happened. "Because I've watched what happens to black men who fight back," he said. Boots. "And I've watched what happens to black men who don't. Either way, they decide the story before you open your mouth." Boots. "I just wanted to still be alive to correct it after." Dana's story ran Tuesday morning under the headline "Officer Grabs Decorated Navy SEAL's 71-year-old father in own yard, then threatens to tase the son." Boots. It was picked up by 3 regional outlets by Tuesday night. By Wednesday, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Chief Roland Wexford had a decision to make, and he made the wrong one, quietly, the way men in his position usually do. Boots. What almost nobody in Sedgefield Park knew, and what Dana Whitmore's second article would eventually reveal, was that Roland Wexford was Grant Holloway's uncle by marriage. Boots. That he had personally pulled Holloway's file from a mandatory review board 18 months earlier, after 2 prior excessive force complaints, and that he had, on Wednesday afternoon, Boots, told his department's public information officer to describe the Birchwood Court incident to the press as a routine welfare check that escalated due to non-compliance. Boots. Non-compliance. Elijah read that word in Thursday's paper and set the paper down on the kitchen table without a sound, the way a man sets down something that was never really his to begin with. Boots. Non-compliance, he repeated quietly. Corinne's hand found his under the table. "They're going to say that about you," she said, "and they're going to keep saying it, unless somebody makes them stop." Boots. Malcolm, standing at the counter, closed his laptop with more force than the moment strictly needed. "Then let's make them stop." Boots. The following Monday, at 9 in the morning, Malcolm walked into the offices of Marsh and Okonkwo Civil Rights Law on East Boulevard, carrying a manila folder containing 11 photographs of his father's arm, taken over 9 consecutive days, a printout of the original 911 call log, obtained through a public records request, and a copy of Cody Marsh's video, downloaded before the platform's algorithm could quietly newer content the way these videos so often got buried. Boots. Elena Marsh, 38 years old, had built her practice on exactly these kinds of folders. She listened to the whole story without writing a single note, then finally spoke. Boots. "2 things are going to determine how far this goes," she said. "First, was this an isolated bad decision by one officer, or a pattern the department already knew about and buried?" Boots. "Second, was that 911 call really about safety, or was it about something else?" "We think it was about the development deal," Malcolm said. Boots. Ridgeline. "My mother says the neighbor across the street has been pushing us to sell for months." Elena's expression sharpened into something focused and quiet. Boots. "If that's true, Mr. Sanders, this isn't just a police misconduct case anymore. It's a civil conspiracy case, and those tend to end careers a lot faster than lawsuits do." Boots. She filed 2 public records requests that same afternoon, one for Officer Holloway's full disciplinary file, and one for every real estate transaction Denise Fairweather had closed on Birchwood Court and the 3 surrounding streets in the past 18 months. Boots. The second request came back first, 8 days later, and it came back ugly. Boots. Denise had closed 9 transactions on properties within 4 blocks of the Sanders house, 7 of them sold to LLCs that public filings eventually traced back to the same parent entity, Ridgeline Capital Partners, and on 3 of those 9 sales, the sellers had, within 30 days prior to closing, been the subject of a nuisance complaint, a code enforcement visit, or a police welfare check called in from an anonymous or unlisted number. Boots. 3 families before the Sanders. Elena read the pattern out loud in her office, and even she, a woman who had built a career on other people's worst days, felt something cold settle in her stomach. Boots. "She's done this before," Elena said, "at least 3 times before you. Hold on to that number. 3. It will be read aloud again, in a room with much higher ceilings, in about 3 weeks. Boots. The first officer's file came back 11 days after that, heavily redacted, but not redacted enough. Grant Holloway had 2 prior complaints for excessive force, both dismissed at the internal review stage without a hearing, both dismissals signed off by the same reviewing officer, then Captain, now Chief, Roland Wexford. Boots. Elena stared at the signature for a long moment before calling Malcolm. "Your instinct was right," she told him. "This wasn't one bad morning." Boots. This was a department protecting a problem for years, because the problem happened to be somebody's nephew. The City Council public safety hearing was scheduled for the 3rd Thursday in May, in the same council chamber where, 6 weeks earlier, nobody had known the name Elijah Sanders at all. Boots. Elijah wore his good gray suit, the one he'd bought for Malcolm's SEAL graduation ceremony 9 years earlier, and had worn exactly 4 times since. Boots. Corinne sat beside him in the front row, her hand wrapped around his the entire 90 minutes, her thumb tracing small, steady circles against his knuckles the way she'd been doing since 1983, whether he needed it or not. Boots. Malcolm sat on Elijah's other side in his dress uniform, having flown back from Naval Station Norfolk for exactly this purpose, having asked for and received 48 hours of emergency leave, with a phone call that took his commanding officer less than 60 seconds to approve. Boots. The chamber was full. Cody Marsh, now something between a witness and a minor local celebrity, sat 3 rows back with his mother. Boots. Ruth Okafor sat near the aisle. Dana Whitmore sat in the press section with a notebook already half filled. Elena Marsh stood first, laying out the timeline with the flat, devastating precision of a woman who had built her entire case on documents rather than emotion, though the emotion in the room built anyway, on its own, without her help. Boots. 3 families on Birchwood Court and the surrounding blocks, she said, were subjected to anonymous complaints, code enforcement visits, or police welfare checks in the 30 days prior to selling their homes to entities linked to Ridgeline Capital Partners. Boots. Miss Fairweather brokered all 9 of the resulting transactions. On April 25th, a 4th family, the Sanders family, became the target of a fabricated 911 call. Boots. That call resulted in a 71-year-old man being physically assaulted in his own yard by Officer Grant Holloway, an officer with 2 prior excessive force complaints, both dismissed without hearing by then Captain Roland Wexford, Officer Holloway's uncle by marriage. Boots. A murmur moved through the chamber like wind through the oak in Elijah's front yard. Holloway, seated near the back in plain clothes, his face rigid, did not react. Boots. He had told his attorney, in the hallway an hour earlier, that he still didn't believe he'd done anything a reasonable officer wouldn't have done under the same circumstances. Boots. He believed it right up until the moment the council chair asked him to explain, in his own words, why he had escalated a request for identification into physical restraint. Boots. I was following standard procedure for noncompliance, Holloway said, his voice flat, careful, the same tone he'd used on Elijah's front lawn 6 weeks earlier. Boots. The individual did not stop when instructed. The individual, the council chair repeated, was walking toward his own front door to retrieve identification you yourself instructed him to retrieve. Boots. He didn't stop when I gave the order. He was 3 feet from the porch of his own home. Holloway's jaw tightened. Boots. I made a judgment call based on the totality of the circumstances. He would say some version of that sentence 4 more times over the next 20 minutes. Boots. He never once said the words "I'm sorry," not to the council, not when given the chance to speak directly to Elijah. Boots. That refusal, small, stubborn, and entirely his own, was the thing that finally cost him everything, not the video. Boots. Not the bruises, the refusal. The council turned next to Chief Wexford, who had prepared a statement about departmental values that he never got to finish reading, because the chair cut him off at the second paragraph with 4 words that landed in the room like a verdict already decided. Boots. Chief, did you know? Wexford's silence lasted 4 full seconds. In a room that size, 4 seconds is a very long time. Boots. I reviewed both complaints, he said finally, and determined they did not meet the threshold for further action. You determined that, the chair said, about your own nephew. Boots. Wexford did not answer that one at all. The council recessed for 11 days to allow the district attorney's office to review the full file, and when the hearing reconvened, the room was fuller than before. Standing room only along the back wall, a line outside the chamber doors that started forming 40 minutes before the doors opened. Boots. Elijah sat where he'd sat before, Corinne's hand in his, Malcolm beside them in uniform once more, this time with an unexpected addition seated directly behind them. Master Chief Silas Cordero, Malcolm's commanding chief at Naval Station Norfolk, who had driven 3.5 hours that morning specifically to be in the room when the verdict came. Boots. The council chair, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Amoa, who had spent 11 days going through Elena Marsh's file line by line, did not waste time. Boots. Officer Holloway, she said, this council finds sufficient evidence of excessive force, false arrest procedure, and a pattern of conduct inconsistent with continued service. Boots. Your employment with this department is terminated effective immediately, and this matter is being referred to the district attorney for review of criminal charges. Boots. The chamber erupted into a low wave of murmurs as Holloway was walked out past rows of stunned faces. Past the same community members who 6 weeks earlier had stood frozen on their porches while he humiliated an old man in his own front yard. Boots. Amoa turned next to Wexford, her expression hardening further. Chief Wexford, given clear evidence that you personally suppressed 2 legitimate misconduct complaints against your nephew over 18 months, this council has no confidence in your continued leadership of this department. Boots. Wexford rose stiffly, his face a mask of controlled defeat. I'll submit my resignation. Effective today, he said, his voice stripped of the authority it had carried into the room. Boots. And I'll cooperate fully with any review. It wasn't an apology. But it was the closest thing to accountability the room would get from him, and for the moment, it would have to be enough. Boots. Finally, Amoa's gaze settled on Denise Fairweather, seated frozen near the back, her earlier prepared explanations having collapsed entirely under 11 days of scrutiny. Boots. Miss Fairweather. Council is recommending an immediate restraining order be filed by the Sanders family, along with a full state investigation into your business dealings with Ridgeline Capital Partners and the pattern of harassment directed at least 4 separate families on Birchwood Court over the past 18 months. Boots. Denise said nothing. She stared at her own hands, the consequences of 3 weeks of small, deniable choices finally arriving all at once. In front of the entire community, she had spent a year quietly trying to dismantle for a commission check. Boots. Amoa closed with one final statement, her eyes finding Elijah and Corinne in the front row. On behalf of this city, I want to offer a formal apology to the Sanders family for the trauma inflicted on them by individuals who were sworn to protect this community and instead used that badge to terrorize it. Boots. Corinne broke down completely then, burying her face against her husband's shoulder. Elijah's own eyes went wet, and for the first time in 6 weeks, he didn't try to hide it. Boots. Malcolm pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called Master Chief Cordeso's cell. The man was sitting directly behind him and answered anyway, and the two of them laughed through the absurdity of it, Malcolm's voice cracking with a relief 14 years of training had never once prepared him for. Boots. It's over, he told his parents, kneeling beside Elijah's chair. No, Elijah said, wiping his eyes, a faint smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. Boots. It's just beginning. Now we get to actually live in this house again. 3 months later, the late morning sun spilled warm and gold across Birchwood Court, the same light that had once fallen so ordinarily over Elijah's tomato bed before that Saturday changed the shape of everything. Boots. Elijah sat in the passenger seat of Malcolm's truck as it pulled up to the curb, his arm fully healed, the purple gone from his skin months ago, though something quieter had stayed behind that no amount of healing would fully erase. Boots. You didn't need to make a fuss, Elijah said, though his voice carried no real protest. Dad, Malcolm said, putting the truck in park. Boots. Look outside. Elijah turned toward the window and went still. The entire street had gathered on his lawn. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder across the grass. Boots. Cody Marsh, the same boy who had once filmed the whole thing in stunned, frozen silence, now held a hand-lettered sign that read, "Welcome home, MR." Boots. Sanders. Ruth Okafor stood near the porch with a tray of lemonade. Families from the far end of the block, people Elijah barely knew by name, had come to stand on his lawn that morning simply because they had heard, and because some things a neighborhood owes itself to show up for. Boots. Corinne stepped out onto the porch, her hands pressed to her chest, tears already gathering, as she watched her husband and son climb out of the truck together. Boots. Welcome home, she called out, her voice breaking with joy this time, instead of grief for the first time in months. Boots. Elijah made his way slowly up the front walk, leaning lightly on Malcolm's arm, while the gathered crowd applauded and called out greetings. Some reaching simply to shake his hand, others offering quiet apologies for staying silent too long during everything that had happened. Boots. Elijah accepted every one of them the same way. A nod, a handshake, no bitterness left in his grip. Elena Marsh stood near the edge of the lawn, a folder of finalized paperwork tucked under her arm, the restraining order against Denise Fairweather, now filed and served. Boots. The state investigation into Ridgeline Capital Partners, now formally opened. A settlement from the city that had quietly covered the remaining 11 years on the Sanders mortgage. Boots. Beside her, Dana Whitmore lifted her camera and took a few photographs, Not for another headline this time, but simply because the moment felt worth keeping. Boots. You did good work, Elena said, glancing at her. We both did, Dana replied, lowering the camera as Elijah reached the porch steps and turned to face the crowd gathered for him. Boots. A truck door closed behind them, and Master Chief Silas Cordero stepped out in full dress uniform, having driven 3.5 hours that morning again, just to be there. Boots. He crossed the lawn directly to Malcolm, who straightened instinctively at his approach. Master Chief, at ease, Sanders. Cordero extended a hand, his grip firm. Boots. Your full clearance review closed yesterday. Everything's clean. You're back to full operational status. Malcolm exhaled something that had been sitting in his chest for 6 weeks. Boots. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Cordero's eyes drifted briefly to Elijah and Corinne standing together on the porch. You earned it the moment you put your family first and your training second. Boots. That's exactly the kind of man this uniform is supposed to represent. Malcolm nodded, unable to find words equal to the moment, and shook his commanding chief's hand again. Firmer this time. Boots. The afternoon unfolded slowly and warmly. Plates of food passed between neighbors who had once only waved politely across the street, now sharing stories and laughter on the Sanders lawn, like people who had always known each other. Boots. Elijah held court from a folding lawn chair someone had brought out for him, telling old stories, glancing toward Malcolm with quiet pride every time his son's name came up. Boots. As the sun began its slow descent behind the rooftops, the crowd thinned, neighbors drifting back to their own homes, until finally only the Sanders family remained on the porch. The lawn quiet again, the folding chairs waiting to be gathered up. Boots. Malcolm stood at the top of the steps, looking out over the street where all of it had begun. The same patch of grass where his father had once been grabbed, the same spot where he himself had once stood between his parents, and a man who had looked at him and seen only a threat instead of a son. Boots. He turned to face Elijah and Corinne standing together by the front door, watching him with eyes full of quiet pride, and reached out to turn the small brass compass on the porch railing once, the way he had every night since he was 6 years old. Boots. Then he straightened his shoulders, squared his stance, and raised his hand in a slow, formal salute. Elijah's chin lifted. Boots. Corinne's hand found her husband's, gripping it tightly. Down the street, a few lingering neighbors who had paused to watch began to clap, the sound rising softly into the evening air, carrying across the same lawn that had witnessed both their darkest morning and, finally, their brightest one. Boots. If this story moved something in you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognize someone in it, take a moment to like it, so it reaches someone who needs to hear it. Boots. Share it if you know someone who needs reminding that they are not invisible, and leave a comment. Have you ever stood in that yard on either side of it? I read every single one.